Oh, welcome to another edition of What the Fuck Happenings from here in Mendham. Yeah, here. If the camera wishes to stay where I put it, this should go okay, right? Yeah. So another week. This keeps happening, one after another, and it just becomes more and more obvious that the conversations that are available are always about subjects that are, the little leaves way out on the little thin branches, and those conversations are made moot if they're not growing on the same tree. I mean, if they're not connected to the same kind of foundational perceptions, because then they'll always fail when that's realized. When you realize, people could be talking about how great the race is. They're watching a race and they're talking about how great the race is, and they'll talk about what it's like to be in the lead, and you could have a conversation about the whole race dynamic. And then eventually, though, it'll all fall apart because one person's talking about, maybe cars that are going 200 miles an hour, and the other person's talking about, I don't know, pill bugs going, whatever, 4 feet a year. So it's going to break down because there won't be any, the thing isn't made of the same stuff. It's not edible, and it'll be found to be just something you chew, and you can never swallow it. So the conversation is doomed in a sense, because there isn't the argument isn't about the subject you're arguing. The argument is about something much more fundamental. So I would say that most disagreements with people fall into those kind of categories where there's a fundamental difference in perception. It's like you could argue economics, but there's almost no point if you believe that the system is in some sense, a reasonably structured system, and that it's just being, there's little brokennesses, little subtle defects created by people breaking the rules and changing the function, or you're somebody who believes that it's fundamentally wrong for fractional reserve banking, to allow somebody to lend more money than they have gold or something, and that will end up being fatal to the conversation, because you're going to end up having to go back to that argument and argue that argument. So what I'm getting to here is that there's always this kind of common thread. I mean, it's the subjects themselves just deteriorate into conversations that go back to these premise arguments about what is qualifying knowledge. What do you have to know to be an expert, or somebody whose opinion's worth forming and expressing and even arguing. And part of me wishes to say that yes, if you have a leprechaun theory, if your tree is made out of vacuous accusations and contentions, you believe reptilians are controlling the financial system or something, some silly notion, even religion, just complete rubbish. And but as a premise, it gives you lots of opportunity to evade applying rational standards to a system, because you can just say, well, God says his will be done, or God says vengeance is mine. So you can just use any kind of cliche out of that babble, and there's a cliche for every circumstance. You can get it to say almost anything. You can get it to say it's okay to beat your wife if that's what you're trying to do. And so it just defeats any kind of conversation, because the logical bounds get exceeded, and you end up, like, again, arguing nonsense. I mean, arguing things you have. Oh, I didn't think I was going to be obliged to explain how, um, reptilians aren't controlling the economy. Um, yeah, no. But that's what it comes down to. So, because we've seen that with Anacondavat. I mean, he just makes these very extraordinarily sweeping and aggressive contentions about reality, and he does it in this little, well, nice little quiet voice, a nice toned down mood, and this extraordinary claims like, well, the knowledge from the past is, it's interesting, it's might be useful to know a few things, but really doesn't matter, doesn't really add up to much. And it's only everything we possess as anything called knowledge or wisdom is derived from it. I mean, every word has been honed over time to have a meaning. And clearly there's lots of bullshit through tradition, and I would argue that that's what we're right in the process of doing, is honing, is finding the bullshit and attempting to extract it. And my argument would be is that unfortunately the way the water's sloshing at the moment, it's sloshing towards idiocracy, and the idiots are winning. And so instead of our language getting more precise and conversation getting more rational, it's getting more fluffy and phony and trivial and superficial, more crayon, more for the ignorant who wish to blame aliens. They want scapegoats, they want simple answers, they don't ever want to think that a problem, they don't even understand the nature of problems. If your car is broken, you don't fix it in some money-saving way. You don't just whack the back fender off. The engine won't start, so I'll just take a sledgehammer and knock the bumper off, and that'll work. I'll just break it. And many people think I can fix it by breaking it. And now fixing it's always going to cost more, not less. It's going to force you to spend more. And so if you have this idea that somehow I can save money and fix it, not in the short term. In the long term you can save money and fix it, but not today. You're going to have to spend more today to fix it for tomorrow. And even those kind of simple facts of life are just totally ignored, by the Trump types. And we end up paying for it in the long run, because we end up with unsustainable economic systems where for whatever it's been, 30 years, 35 years, ooh, scary, the philosophy has been we can run deficits and it's not a problem. We can just keep creating more public debt, and now the public debt is so large that the idea of a savings account or interest on your savings has had to be destroyed. And so now there's no safe way to invest your money. There's only risk adventures, and those have no hedge against failure. Now, you still could probably invest in the market, and if you only wish to get maybe a 5% return, you can probably have a pretty good protection against the crash of the market. But if you want the 10% return, then you're vulnerable to a crash, that kind of thing. But anyway, these are all, I'm almost getting too sophisticated in this conversation, because people don't wish to be at all informed or qualified to have opinions. So they all think it's like if this was music or something, or we were trying to create beautiful music, and that was the argument. That's the analogy for having an argument or a debate. And you have people who don't know how to play an instrument. They can't even barely hum a tune, and yet they're pretending that they can, that they're not retarded and that they can participate because they have an opinion. They formed a perception, and even if it's made out of complete nonsense and they've done no effort to find the truth, they've only read, Bazooka comics or something. They have, I guess, just absolutely no knowledge on the subject beyond something incredible, headline, superficial diagrams, and yet they'll think, oh, I have a well-formed opinion because I don't like it. And so I obviously don't like it. There's got to be a good reason, because my brain is just automatically likes and dislikes things in a very intelligent and qualified manner, and I don't have to do any thinking or research to have a very qualified opinion, which is really stupid. So I mean, I can always see this in my own political evolution, or the evolution of my ideology, that many of the things I did accept on face value turned out to be legitimately true. So I mean, I didn't have to do any huge conversions in my philosophy. But clearly, when I was a kid, I didn't understand that banking doesn't have anything. You have the idea that yes, you invest money, then that money that you put in the bank or something is invested, and you get a percentage, and blah blah blah. And there's first deposits, then loans, and the system is really just the other way around. It's loans, and loans become deposits. And the only thing that really matters is whether they're secured loans. So collateral becomes the only issue in terms of the putting a safety valve on the system. The safety valve just becomes whether you have security. And then obviously in the system we have now, all that's been destroyed because all derivatives and the way they've just resold, or the way they have recollateralized the same assets more than once. So they've basically done the producer thing. They've oversold the play. They've oversold the pie. They have one pie, 10 pieces, and they've pretended, because they can fool the public, that they can sell promises of pie for 30 pieces, even though they only have 10, because at any one time they only have to produce a certain number of pieces of pie. Or people only have to see that the pie exists in some sense in the window, because they don't intend to eat it today. That kind of racket. But anyway, that's getting way separate from the direction I wish to go in. So I mean, an overview of this week would be attempting these conversations that at first seemed to have some sort of focus that was in one place, and they just automatically just drift to the focus being some simple premise. There's not much to argue. In the sense, you can't argue people's religion. You can argue it in the sense you can explain to them the unreliability of religion, how it's, reasonably unlikely, that old primitive stories about reality have any real truth value, and if there is any value, it's just in some kind of simplistic way, like it's not nice to be eaten by a praying mantis. Maybe they could figure that out 2,000 years ago, and maybe it's still true. But if they're going to metaphor a praying mantis as a manifestation of Satan, then there's no point in having the conversation, because you can know that the praying mantis is just a manifestation of exactly the same force that manifested us, and that in many ways we have the same impulses. Blah blah blah. Alright, still not quite where I want to take this. So I mean, I've done a bit of video. I'll have to do another video on the fact that there's just these basic subjects, these axioms. And you kind of have to set up these premises as this is required knowledge. If you don't accept these premises, we're likely going to realize we can't ever talk about anything, because everything is in some way going to be founded on one of these tree roots. These are the only trees in the forest, and if you're going to use some magical tree, the leprechaun tree, it's not going to be it's going to break the subject. I'm not going to be able to see the chain or the links or the logic in the explanation if the explanation starts drifting into trees that I don't see existing. It's like you can't make the monkey swing that way. And so the conversation is over, because as soon as to build your narrative or your story, you create magical staircases or super instantaneous elevators or something that just breaks the physical rules, then the narrative is useless as a guide to how to fix a real problem in the real world, because there are no instantaneous elevators. There's the thing you're saying is a constituent of saving the day. Like Superman will show up. I guess that's as good an analogy as any, right? Here we are with real problems, and you end up arguing, and then you find out that the other person thinks, well, Superman could show up and save the day. I mean, it's in a way creating a net under the whole game that this person is relying on, where you're saying that's completely not going to happen. It's a non-starter. If we're going to accept the premise that we have a fallback position of, well, Superman will save the day, so we don't have to take it too seriously, because if it really gets out of hand, we just call Superman. And that's sort of what it comes down to, is they don't take the threat seriously because they think there's lots of backup plans that involve leprechauns and Superman. And this might be one way of saying it. And it's not on us. We don't have to do it, because, yeah, God will do it if he has to. If he's really forced to, he'll take care of it. And obviously I'm saying that's stupid. Alright. So that's sort of where I'm just stuck, is that it's just this idea that you have to outline these facts, and if I do outline them, no one will agree to them, so there's no point in having, it's almost like it just defeats the point of having the argument, but it might isolate and show why there can't be an argument, is because there really are so few people living today who are willing to be, I suppose that they just don't have a stake in it, so there's no way to make it important to them to have things like integrity, to have things like, if I argue in defense of a certain premise or thing, there's no obligation to be sure. So they'll be an advocate for something, they'll show up for the war, they'll finance the missiles or something, they'll get totally invested, and if it's proven that they're the bad guy, they won't accept the penalty. Okay, of what the penalty should be is that they pay the price, that they are slaughtered on the battlefield, or whatever the appropriate penalty for being colossally wrong is. So there's no real stakeholders, because they don't take honor seriously. So you can almost argue that that's why I've had some, in the past, I've made some arguments that I have some affection for some Asian cultures, because there is this sense of disgracing your family at minimum, or yourself, by doing something foolish and stupid and catastrophic, in the sense that you can't fix the mess you made, and the only decent thing to do is to impose the penalty, so that it's understood that it's basically saying to other people, you don't want to fall into this dishonor, of being reckless or sloppy or unattentive. You want to make sure you are right. You want to be careful. I guess that's the statement. Because if you're not careful, you're going to have to carry and stuff. You're going to have to impose the penalty. And I sort of like that requirement to be fully invested, to have your own guts on the table. Because I'd put my guts on the table for 90% of what I argue. I would accept being tortured if I can be proven to be wrong. That's how confident I am that I have acquired the knowledge and that I've put in the time of thinking about all possible ways I could be wrong. I know there's no leprechauns. I know there's no God. I've thought enough on the subjects to make it impossible to make it have any, there's no potential for it to be a possible explanation for the current circumstance. It couldn't have possibly turned out this way if there was a God who isn't dead. Completely dead. And yeah, I'm sure of that. And I'd risk my guts on it. I'd say, go ahead, torture me if I'm wrong. And if the other people in the argument don't have that kind of integrity, they don't have that kind of, they're not fully invested, in a sense, then yeah, they're probably just really lazy. Their opinion is a headline, not a fact. They will propagandize. They'll say things based on what they know to be fake, essentially statistics. It's like Pirro did, he plays these kind of games all the time. But, just on the subject, he was talking about his stupid open border crap, and then talking about how immigrants commit less crime. And the context is broken in the sense of, well, yeah, they commit not less crime in the sense that if you want to say that, yes, compared to America that has slums, we already know where most of the crime takes place, and ghettos and all that stuff. So it's not comparing it to the population that's making the accusation, that is the working people. He's comparing it to the large percentage of the population who isn't working and saying, well, they're criminals. But he's not saying it. I mean, he doesn't have the guts to say that the crime rate in America is already hugely slanted to one class, one population that can be categorized not only by income, but racially and other things, just by circumstance, I'm not pointing a finger of causality, I'm pointing a finger of effect. So the end effect is that a certain class or a certain describable population, that 90% of the crime is committed by 5% of the population. And so because we have that 5%, because we've created those circumstances, that somehow now immigration's a good idea. And that somehow we get better, we get less crime, when that's not going to be the truth. And certainly it's not going to be the truth when the very thing that creates the crime, which is unemployment, is the very thing the immigrants are threatening to produce. So I'm just saying that it seems like that's a simple enough subject where one should be able to make a few rational arguments explaining why the world isn't in a condition where an open border could make any sense, because there are substantial differences in systems of government, and you'll break them if you allow people to exercise their personal advantage and let somebody else pay for their life. And all you'll end up with is way too many underskilled, overpopulating, expensive people who don't give your economy anything, versus people who do upgrade by having skills and producing value rather than children. That kind of thing. Alright, didn't do that very eloquently either. Yeah, well, I guess that's part of the overall thing I've been thinking about over the last year even, is how to improve how I communicate my understanding. And yeah, I have some ideas. It's just that everything takes time and effort. Polishing does take effort, and that's, you don't get it for free. It takes a lot of rubbing and a lot of work and hands-on and time and energy and all of that kind of thing. And it's hard to, I'm just trying to do too many things with too little time and insufficient endurance to put in the effort. And I should just acknowledge that. I sort of have acknowledged it, but I'm just not willing to sacrifice any of the causes to make myself more, to be a better swimmer. I'm not willing to stop running, or I'm not willing to stop mountain climbing, or, it's like I'm just entering myself in way too many events, so to speak. And so I'm not doing any of them as well as I need to win the gold medal, so to speak. And that's just a fact. So, I mean, this week I spent a lot of time doing this arguing thing about philosophy and didn't do much physics at all. And the physics is probably something I really need to devote some time to, because it's probably in the time frame that exists, it's probably something I can get somewhere sooner rather than later. And wherever I get with that project can only make my ability to function in these other doing these other causes more effective. So it's probably a place I should be investing my time, but I just couldn't let go of the opportunity to make. I mean, the arguments were here to make, so I made them. You just couldn't help it. The weather was too good, so I decided to mountain climb. And well, anyway, so this is so it's all this, doing this as a individual, personal human, trying to find a strategy that's survivable for you personally, and that satisfies you in terms of seeing some value in what you're doing. And but again, it's always, part of you is going to be driven just by the perception of seeing the victims and what's on your mind in terms of which ones are in front of you at any one moment. And and it always shows up. There's always something. Either somebody gets Alzheimer's and that becomes a subject. You hear about somebody else and the sad story of a bunch of feral cats or something, and then that's a subject. Then you see a vegetarian video and you see some horrible images of pigs being abused or something, and then that's on your mind. And it's hard not to get distracted, isn't the right word, because they're all valid, but it does become difficult to balance priorities and to be a good soldier by some kind of good soldier book, because there really isn't a good soldier book that I know of. Yeah. So maybe we'll just leave this as a simpler podcast this week. I won't bother with any other stuff. And just say that I'm working on it. Yeah. Like I said, I do have ideas about how to try to structure argument and conversation, and it's just going to take time to work the details of that out. And I guess at minimum, you would start with the axioms. You really can't. We really can't have a conversation unless you're willing to see the world, without some kind of glasses on, right? Even that's kind of the way to argue. We have to agree that we're all going to look at reality without some sort of obviously potentially perverting, perspective. And so, I mean, if somebody's going to be anti-science or anti, let's say, technical literacy. You have to have some kind of knowledge of science and history and these things. There's certain minimums you have to come to the table with, and those would be defined by understanding these axioms or these premise facts. And so a person who's going to have the argument has to be willing to say, okay, I understand, so I will have the argument in the context of recognizing that there is no Superman to come save the day. And so what do we do to fix a particular problem if we're not going to allow certain nonsense to get in the way? Right. And it's even that cart before the horse thing, because this is the problem with Piro, is he's constantly talking about things that can't happen until you do a whole bunch of other things. So he says something like, I could argue with the whole bird laying eggs analogy, and I could argue that there's a certain expectation that you don't lay eggs in a nest that can't support the chicks. That's just logical. And you can point out how we're in a current circumstance where it's impossible for the nest to support the eggs because, let's say, all of the straw was weakened by storms or something, and so it's all just as a year you can't lay eggs rationally. I'm probably taking this the wrong direction, but he'll keep arguing that you have a right to lay eggs, and somehow the right isn't dependent on the fact that you can't lay eggs in nests that are going to fail, that a certain failure rate is unacceptable. And as soon as that failure rate is hit, you can't allow the activity anymore. There's a certain rule about how bad you'll let things get. And he just keeps talking about this ideal world and what he wants, how he wants things to be in the ideal world, and we aren't even close to being there. We haven't gotten anything to a point where those expectations of what happens in the ideal world are going to happen in the world that will exist, because we're not on the right road to create that world. So I guess that would be the argument. There's no point in talking about how to get to a store that's on a road that goes south when we're traveling on a road that goes north. It doesn't make any sense. Talking about, well, what are you going to buy when you get to the store? And what are you going to do when you're, what do you think's on sale? And, lots of great bargains. No point in talking about it because we're going the wrong way. We're not going to get to the store. Why talk about what we're going to buy at the store we're not going to get to? I guess that's a better analogy. And that has to be, like, one of the rules has to be, you don't bother with that nonsense. I mean, if somebody's talking about making arguments for something in the ideal plane and he hasn't figured out how to get to the ideal plane, he hasn't any description of how we get there from here, then that's just stupid and silly and a waste of time. Yeah. Alright, now that's probably enough. So, who knows? I don't know. I mean, every week's a challenge, and it's it's an interesting time for me personally, just because I'm sort of, I mean, it's as you get older, it just gets more and more, in a way, difficult, and the difficulty of it, the fact that it does get difficult makes you more and more conscious of it. It's like if you started limping, you would be more aware of what it is like to walk. You're more conscious of the process of walking. The more you have a liability or a limitation, the more you focus on whatever the process is that is compromised by that limitation, and you're more aware of the structure required to function. And so I guess I'm just having I'm more aware, instead of just reacting to what's wrong in the world and reacting to the conversations that are possible. I'm more conscious of how you have conversation, and whether it produces, what kind of conversation has any use, and what kind of what's required before to maximize the function of it, to make it's like building a life jacket or something. Just figure out how, well, certain principles. You got to make this stuff so it's lighter than that it's buoyant, and you have to figure out that, oh yeah, well, putting lead in it isn't going to work, so that's really stupid. So I could I could say that I'm more conscious of the fact that I have to tone down some of my language, and I have to be more less vulgar, less hostile. I suppose not less defiant, though, not less accurate. But all those things are just things I'm more aware of lately, in terms of not an overt strategy for merely the purpose of accomplishing the task no matter what, but accomplishing the task and maintaining your integrity. So it's not like just faking it, or tricking, or fooling. You still want people to understand rather than just accept. But I suppose I'm just more conscious of the fact that what are the rules of playing the game of conversation? Because that's all I'm saying. I've never been as focused on why conversations fail, and I've always sort of believed, the general problem is you're never arguing the real subject. It's like the subject of abortion. It's really not about fetuses. People really don't care, and that's sort of obvious, is they don't care about the actual children produced. They won't even finance them once they force them to be created. So it's about some other subject, and it's about sexual liberation. It's about all these old subjects, and it really has nothing to do with fetuses. It just has to do with people resenting other people having sex. But you can't just point that out to people and say, well, you're only arguing this because you have a small penis, and then they'll say, they'll get all defensive. But that's really the only reason why they're arguing. It's usually the subject is usually that simple, and there's usually just a stupid bigotry at the root of some kind of argument, or some other simple personal problem the person making the argument has, rather than any understanding that there's an actual social problem that needs to be fixed. So, whatever. Not as articulate, not as, again, I'm just focused on the, I see so much more, or something better I could have said, and I just didn't say it as well as I wanted to say it. But I know I can say it better, so I guess that's the part that I'll just keep working on. Yeah. is it's really obvious to me. I mean, when I look at what I'm attempting to do, when I'm attempting to describe, you're just saying, what's a pineapple? Describe it. What's the big deal? You'd say, but yeah, when you really think about a pineapple, it's got so many weird little things about it. I mean, how firm it is weird, and the texture is so bizarre, and the little fuzzy little spikes coming out of the top, and then they have little prickers on them, and once you get to, you're saying, what's a fucking pineapple though? That should be, how hard can it be to describe a pineapple? Fuck, it's a pineapple. It's nothing. Yeah, it's not that easy to, when you can't just show people the picture. You can't show people a picture of economics and how it works. You can't show them the picture of all the big, giant, huge pile of money, controlled by the 1%. That's all just handed to them for doing no work. I mean, if I could in some way make a videotape of all the people doing hard work and getting a tiny amount of money, and then the people laughing doing absolutely no work, and they get 1,000,000 times more money. And it's so ludicrous and so preposterous on its face. Well, people should be able to understand that's just crazy. You mean you force people to go into coal mines and risk their lives and breathe crappy air and do all the 115-degree heat, and to earn crappy wages that they can barely afford to take a 2-week vacation once a year, and then you'll give some other asshole for doing absolutely nothing 1,000,000 times as much money? And you say, well, that makes sense. It's logical. It's perfectly appropriate. That's the way you have a good game. You're saying, how can I fail to describe how ludicrous that is? How can I fail in some way not to make it understood just how insanely backward that is? How it can't possibly be a good thing. But even in these conversations this week, this stuff comes up. You talk about torture, and people tie pink ribbons around it and say things like to be tortured, and it's no big deal. How do you do that? How do you do that? How do you put a trivial little it's okay on maggot-covered corpses and stuff? This girl is a really good date. I mean, she's a corpse being eaten by maggots, and they're like saying, "No, date her. She's really cool. She's great. It's great. Really, you'll have fun." Anyway, but I guess that's what I'm struggling with. Is the truth seems so plainly obvious. It's just like, why should I have to argue any of this? This is absolute. I have to defend why I don't want to have sexual relations with a corpse being eaten by maggots. Yes, I shouldn't have to explain that. I should just have to point it out, and everybody should say, "Oh yeah, I totally understand why you're saying that, Gary. Yeah, that would be insane. Why should I have the expectation that you would want to do that? That's crazy. Why would I think you would think it's a great way to organize society and a great fair game for us to insanely not reward hard work and reward falling out of vaginas? Why, I mean, how can people have the expectation to think, why would they think I would think that makes sense? I mean, obviously the only point they can have is that they have to, for some reason, they think they're going to be a billionaire and they need to have the freedom to give their kids billions of dollars because their kids are going to be retarded and incapable of competing. And so they have to buy gold medals for them because, they won't be able to earn them. So, they want to cheat and they want their kids to win, and they don't care if their kids cheat. Cheating's the American way. And I'm supposed to understand that. They think everyone else is such a deplorable crook and bum, that they'd all understand why being a deplorable, cheating, crooked bum is a great thing to be. I mean, it just stuns me that they don't think I would be smart enough to say, that doesn't sound ethical, it doesn't sound fair, it doesn't sound like what a man would want from a world. It sounds like what a diabolical, cheating weasel would want. I don't know. Anyway, so this is enough, I'm sure. I mean, I really don't need to overdo it. Too many wires around me most of the time, so they get tangled. And anyway, and then stuff falls over, and that's a little bit inefficient. So that's one of those other things where it's kind of obvious. You do the same thing over and over again. There's a point where you say, well, you should fix that, instead of just putting it off. You know, instead of just pushing it out of the way temporarily, you ought to really take the time to invest in fixing it, and that way you'll save so much more time in the long run. And I have to admit, some of that isn't I guess in some ways you know, yeah, it's not as much fun, and so you don't do that. And you have to kind of know that it's not about what's the most fun. You know, it's about right, wrong, sensible, reasonable, practical fact. Ooh, there you go. Practical fact. That should be something. That should be something. That should be a real holy thing. That concept, practical facts. And you kind of have to be obedient to those. The practical facts are important. Yeah, so I should have thought of that when I started the video. That would have been practical. That would have been obedient to practical facts. Was to recognize ahead of time that I probably should have just talked about practical facts. Maybe I should write that down. That'll probably be the practical thing to do. Yeah. Just to write it down so I can work on being more obedient to practical facts. Alright, till next time and such.